I'm Scott Snibby, and this is A Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment. For the 1 year anniversary of our podcast, I've finally managed to convince my partner and producer, Stephen Butler, to step in front of the microphone. Hi, Stephen.
Hey Scott, how are you?
Hi. Today's episode is an interview with Stephen, who's lived a creative and compassionate life as a multi-Grammy-nominated record producer of Indigenous and Native American music, a scholar of Tibetan Buddhism and Himalayan culture, and a dedicated student of Vajrayana Buddhism. Stephen's the disciple of Geshe Nawang Dakpa, our resident teacher at Seichen Ling Center for Tibetan Buddhist Studies, where Stephen and I met 20 years ago. Stephen, thank you so much for getting in front of the microphone today. I know talking about yourself can be a challenge for someone as humble and as giving as you, so I appreciate you letting me give you the spotlight for a few minutes today to share your life.
Oh, it's great to be here, Scott. Yeah, very different to be on this side of it, but yeah, I'm really glad to be here. So,
Yeah, thank you so much. So, I would love to ask you the question you usually ask people who are Buddhists, which is how you got into Buddhism.
yeah, so I started reading about Buddhism. Well, first, I grew up in a spiritual household, and in a household where both parents, in very different ways, were not just who were living a spiritual life or a life of contemplation or reflection in their daily life. So that was something that really set the tenor for everything that was to come. And I'm deeply thankful for that. They both did it in different ways, but there was an atmosphere of seeking and I would say genuine seeking and spiritual practice that pervaded the household on a daily basis. And so I grew up Christian and Catholic and was very involved in that. I was really deeply interested in understanding what it meant to be a Catholic and what it meant to be a Christian, and was in a household and in a community that supported that, a spiritual community as a child that was very, very nurturing. Um, but it was probably around 16 that I began with a small group of friends in high school to become interested in Buddhism specifically. It's kind of puzzled me thinking about it now because I don't really recall like the little spark, but it was definitely this group of friends just making a determined kind of move towards understanding what Buddhism was. There were no Buddhism classes in school at that time. You know, it was something you had to go out and find on your own. But so that led us to reading books.
Hmm.
You know, I do remember going to the library and checking out book after book after book. So gradually, though, by my senior year in high school, I had made connections with a spiritual community, a Theravadan community in Arizona. And I spent a number of years studying with them and practicing with them. And then by my time in college, I was an East Asian studies major and religious studies minor. So a lot of my studying was thankfully Buddhism. I studied with some great teachers, Dr. Robert Gemello, Dr. Elizabeth Harrison, and that really nurtured me to become very interested in Mahayana Buddhism, what we call Mahayana Buddhism. And by 1993, I had encountered the teachings of Tibetan Buddhism and was definitely interested in that. So that was really how it started, and that thankfully it continued until 1999 when I connected with my principal teacher, who you mentioned, Geshe Ngawang.
Mm.
Um, and I was really, by that time, very seriously interested in studying with a teacher in the Tibetan tradition. So that's kind of what led me to Buddhism. But it was very nice being in a household. I mean, it was obviously very hard for my parents to not share. I still remember my mother saying it was very hard to not share the spiritual path
Mm.
um, that we shared growing up. What was interesting, my father said, you know, well, he's trying his best to live a good life. So that's a wonderful thing, isn't it? And my mom and dad were so supportive of that. And what's interesting is still in that household, there's a daily discussions of spiritual life and seeking and self-reflection. Of So it's very much the same household. It's just manifesting in different ways, and it's quite amazing. My mother and my family, they've participated in Buddhist things over the years. They're very close to the Buddhist community, and I still go to mass with my family, and when I'm with them, for us. So that was a really a very deep gift. And then, of course, meeting Geshe Dapa and studying with him, which is of deep significance to my life.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about that. I think if they made a movie about your childhood, they might call it "I Was a Teenage Buddhist" or something. You're lucky. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and that's the interesting thing. Like, I go back to like what started this all, and I mean, I was really like, I was in religious education as a Catholic. I went through that, and we were really engaged in discussions. I mean, I think that was the other thing. My spiritual community as a Catholic was very much engaged in discussion. So when I look back now, I can see that encountering Buddhism was just an extension of that. And it manifested in the form of a different faith, a different spiritual path, but it was very much the same thing. So, and like I said, my family, Thanksgiving dinners are extremely interesting because of the different types of faiths that show up.
Yeah.
And that's a wonderful thing. So, I mean, I think going back to what we do at the podcast, Scott, is like, I'm so thankful that I was in a household that was supported by everybody, of being skeptical and talking and having discussions, and very little judgment, very, very little heavy judgment about how that critical analysis should be conducted, or in what form. So I'm deeply thankful for that.
Yeah, you're really fortunate that your family was so open-minded. Did you expose them to there's a book called The Good Heart that's about the Dalai Lama's talks with Christians, and Father Lawrence Freeman, who I talked to a few months ago, who reintroduced meditation into Christian communities, borrowing from Buddhism. Have they been exposed to that? Did that build any bridges?
Definitely. That book is on our family bookshelf at home, and it's been there for years. And yeah, definitely the contemplative side of Christianity was something that there was a strain in the household that was really respected, that determination to bond and to practice a spiritual path. So people who were emblematic of that, and books and things like that, Thomas Merton, Bed Griffiths, these people were really respected in our household, and still in our life and stuff. So books like The Good Heart, and I mean, my family's traveled overseas. Some of them have lived in nunneries and volunteered, and at that level. And we've had Tibetan lamas at the house for Thanksgiving dinner. So along with Jesuits, and that's been a really, really unique experience for me. And yeah, so that dialogue, that's very much in that book. I feel very grateful that was in our home, and still is in our home. And yeah, still in our daily conversations. I mean,
Yeah.
it's remarkable. So
There's an amazing quote from that book, right, where at the end, they were Jesuits or Benedictine monks, and they actually said after the Dalai Lama's talk, he'd increase their faith in God, right?
well, and isn't that a wonderful thing?
Yeah.
I mean, there is an element of that to witness faith, and to witness a spiritual path, or a path of even seeking or self-development or self-reflection, to bear witness to that absolutely has to, if you're truly committed to that path in your own way and in your own faith, I feel it has to elevate you. It has to inspire you. And that's one thing that I think we need a lot more in the world, is not just the commonality of or the acceptance of faiths and the interfaith dialogues that have been going on. I mean, we have a Pope, Pope Francis, we have people
Hmm.
like the Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu, Mother Teresa, members of the Muslim community, the Sikh community, and beyond. That's when you go to those interfaith dialogues, it's inspiring because they're all dialing into this journey that they're all on, manifesting in a different way with different modalities, different tenets, different views. But there's a bonding over that process of developing oneself in accordance with a path. And every other people from another faith have kind of developed themselves in those ways and kind of feeling inspired by it and
Mm.
elevated by it. There's a
Right.
lot of wonderful things to be born out of interfaith dialogues.
Yeah, that's nice. Well, it's great you had had and have such a supportive family. I want to go back to talking about Geshe Dakpa. So, our podcast is typically for people who don't have a guru, don't consider themselves Buddhist, but even Buddhists, like a lot of Buddhists we encounter, even in our tradition, they have a difficult time finding a teacher or bonding with a teacher. And in this Tibetan tradition, it's seen as very important to have that relationship. And sometimes people are jealous of people like you who make such a close connection with a teacher like that. Very clearly, this is your main teacher, and you have like a very close connection. Could you talk a little bit about that? I know it's very personal, but could you talk a little bit about like how that connection formed, how you found that respect and devotion to our teacher?
Well, yes. Again, buoyed by a path of being on a path of seeking and orienting yourself that way. When you encounter somebody who turns your mind, shifts your perspective, um, that's kind of the spark. Is they that's really kind of the thing that I think started it. With Geshe, with my teacher Geshe Tapa, it was very, very immediate for me. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I was coming to this community with a very determined um, hope, I should say, of meeting a teacher because I wanted to study in earnest. And there is as I said, I mean, my path started with books. And I think a lot of us, it'll start with a book or a film or a podcast or a public talk or something. There is a point in the path that it is, from the traditional Buddhist perspective, not only is it deeply beneficial to have that, but it's really important. It does take on great importance because quite often they'll bring up the notion of, well, if you're climbing a mountain, you really want a qualified guide.
Hmm.
So definitely for the deeper precipices and trickier pathways on the spiritual path, you really want to have a guide or a mentor, and that's from the traditional perspective. That being said, though, there's the element of having a teacher or a mentor who's a constant source of inspiration, of encouraging you to remain fresh with your path, to remain open, and to remain curious and critical and joyful. Joy is such a huge component for any job, any endeavor we do in life. And it's so critical for, I think, for, meditation practice or spiritual practice, or even just self-reflection or therapy, having a degree of joy there. And quite often the teacher and a mentor is there to give you that, to kind of renew that source of joy and that inspiration. And that is so crucial. So, yeah, so for me, that bond with the teacher is the most important in my life. And because it permeates all other bonds, it helps me um, uh, be the best I can. So, and quite simply, but it is, I think you can get that from a book, you can get that from a talk, and it's only later in the path when you really commit that it's quite required, and it's really, really beneficial. And that's why um, that requirement comes in, is because of the benefits that
Hmm.
really come from having that.
Mm.
In a nutshell, you could say a
Yeah,
lot more in
of course.
scholarly.
Yeah.
I mean, there are texts, there's commentaries written on the relationship, but I
Yeah.
think
Well,
that's
it's interesting. It's more interesting to hear your personal point of view.
yeah.
Your personal story is very touching. You can see how much devotion and love you have for Geshe when you're together. So very, very touching. Maybe we can
But
find a picture of you two together when we put this episode out.
well, I think along that, Scott,
Mhm.
too, it's really it's get it's the teacher's care for the students that's
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
remarkable.
Yeah.
Is there's in Tibetan Buddhism in particular, there are these tremendously effusive, deeply moving, some of the deepest, most moving poetry you'll find is when students write about their spiritual teachers.
Mm.
And it's because it's a way of repaying that inspiration and the great kindness that they've given, because you see it manifest in your own spiritual development, and to be a comfort, to be a guide, to scold you and kind of get you on the right path when you need to. I'm not talking that the teacher
Mm.
scolds you. I'm saying that that's what we do when we go on a path, is we kind of say, oh, that's, I could have done that better, and stuff like that.
Hmm.
Scold is probably not the right word, but guide. When they guide you in that way, they write this poetry out of a deep feeling of gratitude for inspiring and helping somebody on the path.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Very nice. So, like me, I think you may be the only Buddhist that a lot of your friends know.
yeah.
And when the friends meet little obstacles in life, sometimes they probably go to you and ask you for advice. Like, what do you say to? But also, like me, I bet most of them are not ready for any religious commitment. They're more looking on how to adapt these practices into everyday life, not to take on the beliefs of any religion, including Buddhism. So, what do you say when people come to you, when your friends come to you asking for some help? you know.
Oh yeah, no, I mean it's true. I mean, and especially like you and I are our age, and the kind of our age in relationship to the arc of Buddhism kind of arriving in North America. It situates us in an interesting, in a way, with our friends and stuff. But you're right. Yeah. Um, Thankfully, you know, I do. So when those friends, let's go back. So when those friends come and they ask, about it, quite often they're asking out of a need.
Hmm.
They're asking out of a very specific need. Whether it's, they're asking about, they may have a stressful job or something like that, or they're not sleeping well, and they always think, oh, that Stephen guy, he's been doing that for a long time. I'll go ask him. And or uh, in my case, I've had a lot of people reach out to me when people have passed or they're ill, and about coping mechanisms for those kinds of traumatic things. So yeah, you never really want to encourage them to I mean, to adopt something that doesn't feel right to them. That's not going to help anybody. But what they usually are resonating with is this very clear tradition in Buddhism of openness.
Mm.
And I think there's it's very interesting to see through people's understanding of meditation, or seeing the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hanh or Pema Chodron, these luminaries who are out there in the public sphere. There's a sense of openness and of gentleness. And quite
Mm.
often that is not reinforced in our society. Our society from an early age is pushing us constantly to do more, develop faster, develop in a different way, develop according to somebody's expectations. And so that's reinforced in education, in the job space, in families, in travel. When you take a vacation, it's even reinforced. So I think what people see in Buddhism at the outset, at least the friends who've come to me, is an openness
Mm.
and a gentleness And the fact that you can engage with something in a more open way at the outset, whether that's through meditation or contemplation or, um, whatever it may be, reading. But I think that at the outset, I always think that's what people resonate with.
Mm.
They may think that it's, oh, I want to learn meditation or I want to learn this, but I think like the actual essence of what they're resonating with is this openness and the fact that Buddhism has such amazing traditions and very detailed traditions of accommodating
Mm.
all of life.
Mm.
It's allowed into your practice. It's not regimented and adjudicated very heavily, which does happen in society, and other traditions may manifest that way. I feel all traditions have that kind of openness to them, but I think Buddhism definitely has a reputation, I should say, of being uh, having this open quality
Mm.
that accommodates all dimensions of life,
Mm.
good, bad, and ugly, and certainly with suffering, because that's quite often what people who want to pick up a book or listen to a podcast is out of some need of difficulty, dissatisfaction, or something.
That's really nicely to distill such a complex path down to openness and gentleness is very nice. And it's, we had interviews with Rick Hansen and with Robert
Yeah.
Thurman, our last two interviews, and both of them emphasize exactly those 2 points that, the brain is trainable. We have neuroplasticity, and we've shown we can train people to be fierce and angry and so on. But really the direction we want to go to for a happy life is to train ourselves simply to be open and gentle. I watched them both last night in a talk together, and they both emphasize exactly that point. So it's nice to hear you spontaneously and independently say the same thing.
Oh yeah, and it's amazing because you begin to realize like how much we adjudicate ourselves, our behaviors, the way we think. Um, you know, they they're we need a little more Mr. Rogers.
Yeah.
I'll be very frank with you. I grew up in a household that had great respect for him, and I can't tell you how much I quote him because
Mm.
it's interesting. His way of approaching things is everything can be accommodated.
Mm.
You know, I think he says if it's mentionable, it's manageable.
Mm.
So that's for me, that's deeply in line with Buddhism. In fact, if I didn't know any better, I would say, oh, that was attributed to some Eastern Tibetan nomad practitioner, scholar practitioner. But so I think, yeah, that's
Mm.
really, really key. And I think it embraces people, even the notion of that there's something out there that's open and less boxed in and less codifying who I am, my experience, what I'm thinking, this thought, that thought. Everything is pushing us to codify it and
Mm.
adjudicate it, diagnose it, pounce on it. So as soon as you hear that there's another approach that's a little bit more open and accommodating and gentle, you just immediately, I think on the physical level, the psychophysical level,
Mm.
people just feel like there's hope. It's something wonderful. So
Yeah, I like you mentioning Mr. Rogers as embodying that openness in our culture. We should have had you wear a little button-down sweater for this
oh yeah,
interview.
I could have had my coffee cup. I've got a Mr.
Right.
Rogers coffee cup
Oh,
that
nice.
I love.
Nice. So I want to ask you a bit about traveling has been a big part of your life, traveling extensively in the Himalayan regions of Nepal and India. And I know you've even spent months living in monasteries and supporting cultural humanitarian causes there. Could you tell us a little bit about your travels and what you've learned from them?
Yeah, it all goes back to I met an individual in 1993 while I was in college who was a Westerner who was a Tibetan Buddhist monk who already I was like as I mentioned I was studying East Asian Buddhism because I already had a job working with Native American music, so I figured I'd study something that was really dear to me. And during that time, that's another story we could talk about. But yeah, but a person, I was able to host a monk at that time who really just told me, like, you can go to these places. You can go to Asia, you can go to these monasteries, you can go visit these holy sites and these places where people have practiced and tried to develop these qualities, in India and other places in Asia. So he really set the spark. And so there was a determination even before I graduated college to, when I graduated, I would go do like a sabbatical and go
Mm.
traveling. So in 1996, I think it was about 7 months, I went to maybe 13 different countries, 12, 13 countries, and did the traditional Buddhist pilgrimage at that time.
Mm.
And for me, it was deeply moving, because I was able to see en masse the living tradition of Buddhism and the devotion and that is in a Buddhist community on large scale. So that was deeply moving. And then that set a course for me to continue going back again and again. And the more I went back, I got involved in little bits and pieces of projects, and then eventually it turned into. In one case, I assisted um, a Tenboche monastery. I did a partnership with them, Tenboche Monastery, which is on the southern slopes of Mount Everest. And we documented and recorded a festival, a religious festival, and made audio recordings that were commercially released, and to just get the message out about what the community was doing there. They were also doing things at the time that were really focused on environmental sustainability, which has become common parlance in the Himalayas. But at that time, it wasn't. So I was able to kind of get in touch with communities that were helping in that way. And then again, through my connection to my teacher, I'd go back and other teachers, go back to India quite regularly for teachings, and for pilgrimage. But it was eventually the um, the travels turned into less traveling and more going for a specific purpose
Mhm.
that ties into my um, uh, spiritual path. So I would go over for teachings and instructions. I have some teachers that live over there. Some have passed away, and so I would go over, and whenever those events were happening, I'd attend
Mm.
those. So, yeah, but it's been a real privilege, again, because I grew up in a household that was involved, being an ally of Indigenous and Native American cultures. It was very normal for me to go over to those cultures in the Himalayas and find a way to plug in to help support what people were doing. And so I recorded music and produced video content for grassroots things, wrote text, just tried to be of use in any way, shape, or form. But it was really renewable for me. It felt good to be helping and applying my skill set, in communities that were upholding the Buddhism, something that was near and dear to me. So yeah, but it's also been, you know being able to go over for those large events and seeing the devotion, and the history, around these contemplative traditions, specifically in India, that we've talked about a lot on the podcast, and just to know that they've been there for millennia
Mm.
is deeply inspiring, and that they've survived. You know, they've survived warfare. They've survived tremendous cultural genocide. They've survived just the normal ravages of time, and that these kind of traditions of trying to make yourself gentle and
Mhm.
compassionate and loving and beneficial are still there and venerated has been deeply inspiring for me.
Mm. So to experience the unfiltered roots of this
Yeah,
tradition. Yeah.
yeah,
Very nice. I want to ask you a little, the things you mentioned about audio recording point to your career, your day job, what you do with most of your day, in most of your adult life has been being a producer of Indigenous and Native American music. And you've been nominated, I think, for 21 Grammy Awards with that work, working with some amazing artists. Can you tell us a little bit about this work and what meaning it has in your life?
Yeah, it's again, it goes back to the household I was raised in, and it goes back to my mother in particular. My mother was working for a company called Canyon Records, which is one of the oldest continuously owned, managed record labels. It started in 1951, and it's specialized in recording Native American and Indigenous music in Phoenix, Arizona. And my mom was already there before I was born, so I grew as white as I am. Managed to grow up in a household where some of the first music I remember hearing was Indigenous
Hmm.
music, and which is still bizarre to me because obviously at that time, very few people, if any, in the United States were getting an education about Indigenous peoples in public schools, and thankfully, I had this frontline education, um, but also an atmosphere where it was just part of life. My mom, on our family trips when we were young, we would stop off at trading posts, and my mom would check in on clients, and we had friends in the community since I was very, very young. So that was the atmosphere I grew up in. And I started working there in some form, probably when I was about 13 years old, just after school, helping out here and there. And then by probably about the time I was 20, I started earnestly producing productions. And so I ended up with Canyon producing about 200, somewhere between 200 and 230 productions of traditional, neo-traditional, which is a genre that I helped give birth to,
Hmm.
um, in terms of codifying the name of it, neo-traditional music and contemporary music. And when Canyon Records stopped producing new music, the core creative team and many of the artists, we've set up new shop as Buffalo Jump Records, continuing the same exact work with virtually the same people. But alongside my spiritual path, it's been a huge source of education, a huge privilege, an extreme honor. As I get older and older, I'm more and more appreciative of that honor, to be able to work under such intimate conditions with cultures and cultural representatives that have experienced marginalization, um, in addition to genocide, in addition to racism. To be a white man who has, in a very strange way, spent most of my life around Indigenous music and cultures. I'm not an expert, but I'm very, very thankful for that privilege. Yeah, so I continue that work to this day. I'm in the process, just even as we speak, I have 13 productions that are be coming out this year, and
Hmm.
just am deeply renewed by the connections, many of them multi-generational connections I have with people in the community. So it's been a deep joy, and uh, yeah, like I said, a source of renewable inspiration and deep humility.
Yeah, so it's really nice. I mean, the work you do is beautiful. People can't see it in the podcast. You mentioned your racial identity. We're
Yeah.
both white males.
Oh yeah.
I think it's worth talking a little bit more about how, especially right now, these issues of racial identity and respect, and also just getting out of the way, are big right now. How do you navigate that as someone whose your job is to preserve and promote Indigenous culture, Native American culture? How do you walk that tightrope of being respectful and yet not being directly in that culture?
Well, it has to. and again, it came very early. There was the unique circumstances of how I got involved with it was one that was never out of it was really out of a pure partnership. There was a degree of partnership with the man who established Canyon Records, where he just wanted to partner with a certain singer at the time to get a collection of songs recorded. And that was it. It was not about adjudicating it. It was not about saving the culture. It was very careful about the cultural preservation notion because there's a dimension of that, but it's never coming from my side. Of course, I'm there to support it, but really what I'm there to do is reflect what's happening in the communities and the artists that I'm working with. And so the notion of being an ally has to be defined at the very outset, and permeate every workflow that you have. And really, to condense it, you want to go in and not be the one who's telling these stories yourself. You never think that you're telling these stories yourself or that you need to be the one telling these. What you do, though, is in tandem with these people that you're working with, whether they're an artist, whether a thought leader, an elder, a culture, a knowledge holder, you know that their story needs to be told.
Mm.
And that's the definition. You're very clear about the definition that I'm come in to not tell the story, but these people's stories need to be told. And the one thing I can say is I can also help find a way to tell the larger community that this story needs to be heard and paid attention to. So it's that part of the role that you focus on. And so every relationship, in a sense, becomes it's extremely unique. Every tribal group, every family group, every clan group, every community group has their own way of presenting their cultures. So quite often you're very transparent in your work. You're just there to not interfere with what's happening, but to just help the artist transmit it. And by that, I'm not telling them to change the content. You're really just there to have it pass through you to help go and hit these other objectives of the artist wanting to share it with their community and beyond.
Mm.
So being really clear in your role is very, very important. And you have to constantly be educated and be open and be very knowledgeable that you are there as a guest.
Mm.
You are there as um, a person who is constantly learning and staying open to learning and will make mistakes. I've made many, many mistakes in the course of that learning. Um, but I always come to it with the point of view with that I'll learn from those mistakes and let the people that I'm privileged enough to work with educate me on that journey. And even more so now, I mean, like I said, some of the people I've been privileged to work with, who for me are as important to North American traditional culture as Woody Guthrie.
Oh yeah.
People's names that people won't even know. Like the Baker family, the Tutusis family, the Bill Runsabove, names like that, William Horncloud. For me, these are Woody Guthrie's.
Mm-hmm.
And my job is there to help those people who carry that knowledge and that tradition to help communicate that importance to their communities and to others, but to not really interfere in anything. So being very knowledgeable at it at the outset is super important. Being
Mm.
very conscious that you're an Indigenous ally and you're an ally. You're not telling the story. You're there to help the story be told, and you're there to emphasize that the story must be heard
Mm.
because of the history of Indigenous peoples, what they've had to undergo, and the marginalization that continues to this day. And as we talked about, it's even more important now because the marginalization with what's happened in the last several years, marginalization is coming to the fore. There's huge dialogues, especially up in Canada, where now these discussions are able to happen at the level of policy. Hopefully in the United States, those are going to continue to come up. But the notion for truth and reconciliation with the past in relationship to Indigenous people is makes it even more important to be to adhere to principles of being an ally, and to also know those principles may evolve.
And can you talk a little bit? We had Dr. Jan Willis on the podcast last year, and these issues of, race and gender and class came up with Dharma centers. Have you seen or thought about those issues of being white and and then being in a community of people that aren't white as it relates to Dharma centers and Buddhism in America?
Yeah, what Dr. Willis said was really crucial advice and crucial guidance for all of us involved in any way, shape, or form with Dharma organizations and Buddhist centers, is to acknowledge that that exists, that there is a disparity, and that has to be addressed. And there's some organizations that are taking brilliant steps to make that happen, which is really long overdue. But yeah, absolutely. And having structures and the dialogue, I think as Dr. Willis said, to acknowledge that we're swimming in the water of systemic racism, whether we feel, however we relate to that topic, we have inherited the residue of it. And if it's just residue, or if it's however it is, we have to work actively to address that. So because that's really the Dharma, you know.
Hmm.
I mean, if you go back to the historical roots of Buddhism in northern India, it thrived among a multitude of classes, and obviously in India, it's really ethnically diverse in terms of, of course, we have this word caste. It's a bit tricky to talk about, but Buddhism was open to all, and we have to remember that, and that's like a core principle, and so that has to be brought to bear on the disparity within Dharma organizations in terms of gender and racial equality,
Hmm.
and how the organizations are structured. So it really isn't coming from, I don't see it coming from the faith, obviously. The core message is there. It's just the inherited structures of organization that still um, are really based on outmoded gender and racial lines.
Yeah.
So I think Dr. Willis is just a beam of light for that, because she's saying there's a pathway to deal with it, but you do have to acknowledge it.
Mm.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's a tricky topic to talk about, and I appreciate how honest you are about it.
Oh yeah, and as I mentioned, about talking about Indigenous music and my work with that, there's a time to step out of the way. In
Yeah.
fact, you from the beginning, you're never supposing that you're to be the center of the dialogue. You're never really envisioning that you're part of it. That's really important. And I think with the this discussion, this evolving discussion of bringing in racial bias and gender bias into Dharma organizations, we have to also be willing to step aside and to also not place ourselves in the center of the solution either, is to let that dialogue come in and be a participant, but be a participant on the outside,
Hmm.
and then recalibrate as we go forward.
Well put. I wonder if this is also a little bit personal, but I wonder if you'd be willing to share anything about your own meditation practice and any techniques that have been particularly helpful for you. Like, of course, in the spirit of benefiting the people who are listening.
Oh, yeah, no, I don't really talk too much about that,
Yeah.
just because it's really I think it's more the approach
Yeah.
that's the important thing. But I'm really privileged to have tried my best to meditate since I was in high school,
Mm.
and the one thing I would say in particular about like meditation is I've really come to appreciate the qualities of being gentle.
Mm.
The Buddha's fifth instruction to not push, and to really bond with the meditation, even in its more rudimentary or more coarse stages. I think that's something that's really, really struck me is as I get older, is to really, um, those earlier stages of meditation, awareness of the body, awareness of the breath, to really bond with those and let them permeate. Because all the study you do, whether it's devotional practice, any other thing, even if it's faith in one's teacher or a willingness to read a book, all of that is buoyed by
Mm.
and anchored by those things: awareness of body, awareness of thoughts. So I think there's some great teachers that really emphasize that point. And I think I've also gotten an appreciation that it's really hard to do.
Yeah.
Um, really having a broad view. I think there's a pith instruction of having a broad view, um, and but having a long view. Being committing to developing yourself to benefit others is long work, and to really kind of slow down and say that it's a lot of work, and just be patient and gentle with yourself as you go. Quite often in the West, I mean, we book time, right? Everything's booked. I'm
Hmm.
booked. See, we always say like, oh, I'm booked. I don't have time for that. And we quite often we book our retreats, we book our spiritual sessions. That's a necessary component, but it's also something to be really conscious of, that you don't want to rush and push. And even study is the same way. You want to have the openness and the quality, the natural quality of the mind, in its restful state, is in its centered state, is brings so much benefit to devotional practice, to study, to meditation, to questioning, Q&As, whatever it may be. So really paying attention to that's really, really helped me. And I go back to that quite often. I think they even, it's even said, teachers have said, even just having awareness of body,
Hmm.
really true awareness of body, is a deeply profound practice in and of itself, and it's very, very hard to achieve. So those instructions have been really helpful. I think the other thing that's particular to Tibetan Buddhism is this tradition of mind training.
Hmm.
The Kadampa Geshis, and the people who uphold that tradition. The Kadampas were these, it was a school of thought that's been absorbed into all the other schools of Tibetan Buddhism, and upheld. But they were known for these very pithy, immediately applicable sayings of how you apply tricky spiritual practices to daily life. And those are there's just endless, it's a gold mine of instruction. And so
Hmm.
those are really, really helpful to me.
Hmm.
Um, and to work with what you have, and to be willing to, Dzigar Kongtrul Rinpoche, who we interviewed, in our podcast here, who did a guided meditation. He says the mind of practice is a poised mind. It essentially can accommodate anything.
Mm.
So pith instructions like that, and that are upheld by the Kadampa Geshis as
Hmm.
well, and teachers like the Dalai Lama, and so many of our teachers are so profound. As Geshe Ngawang always says, very easy to understand, but very difficult to do.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
really, the mind that of practice can accommodate anything. Those are instructions that really, really help everything, and any difficulties that come up on the way.
And can you say what mind training means, a definition of mind training for people who aren't familiar with it?
Yeah, I mean, I again, this is like, Tarzan telling you how to cook like chicken marsala or something like
Yeah.
that, very detailed. Um, and that's no offense to Tarzan. But really, yeah, so it's this tradition of working with the mind. In Tibetan, it's called lojong. There's a whole category of texts, tradition, meditative practices that really, they trace their origin, of course, to the Buddha. And in particular, they trace their origin to Nagarjuna and Shantideva and practices that come out of a couple of texts that they wrote. But it's really about working with the 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 emotions and the difficulties and immediately overcoming them by acknowledging that they can be worked with at the outset. So that's
Hmm.
really the principle. That's the principle of all Buddhism, is
Mm.
that the mind can be transformed. But the mind training is really saying even these very difficult, tricky things like jealousy, ingratitude, defamation, anger, lust, all of these things can be worked with, and that
Mm.
they're all the substance of spiritual practice. They all become that. So that's really what mind training is. And there's just tremendously, Thupten Jinpa has done some great translations. He's translated really the compendium of the classical compendium of mind training teachings. But there's a tremendous wealth. Pema Chodron brings those into her talks and teachings quite
Hmm.
you know regularly, and it's because it acknowledges there's a lot of grist for the mill, and that's what we have to do, is to get our hands a little dirty and be willing to and be open to and not run away from that.
Mm.
And quite often the word that like Pema Chodron in particular uses when she talks about this is this quality of fearlessness.
Mm.
So in mind training, you have this acknowledgement that it can be worked with. So right there, it's saying don't be afraid of it. It's saying better to be curious than to be afraid. Whereas in
Mm.
society, we're reinforced to retract from difficulty, recede from it, pull back from it, bypass it. Mind training is saying the total opposite, which is work with it. It's the substance of the mind, and it can be transformed.
Mm. So mind training means that we can work with anything.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah,
that's right.
yes, definitely.
Yeah, Tara Brach also talks. I was really struck by her radical self-acceptance. I
Yeah,
went through that a number of times, and she says exactly the same thing. Like when you have the mind of curiosity, there's no room for fear.
yeah,
So,
absolutely. Well, and Pemich will bring in, a nice confluence of
yeah.
indigenous topics, and Buddhism. But Pema Chodron recounts the story of Ishi, who was a member of the Yahi tribe. Some of us have probably seen this old film called The Last Yahi,
Oh
Ishi,
yeah,
The
when
Last
you grow up
Yahi.
in California, we all study it in middle school.
Exactly.
We all read the book. Yeah.
So, but she brings up this great quote, which I believe, if I recount it correctly, is Ishi, once he was brought out and shared with the larger culture, and his story was shared. He recounted about the experience of encountering these very foreign and challenging aspects of modern culture. So I think at one point says he remembers seeing a railroad snaking through the mountains. I use that word in particular because he said, for us, we just thought it was a snake that gobbled up people. We saw people just get into the train and it just gobbled us up. And so, right there, I mean, that's a terrifying image, especially if you've never encountered it. But I believe when Ishi was brought out in one of these forums, where people could ask him questions, somebody said, well, then why did you decide to get on the train? And why did you decide to come out and encounter this other culture around you? And he said, because believe it's better to be curious than afraid. And Pema
Mm.
Chodron recounts that even in her Buddhist teachings. So that is such an important quality, is to not recede. Dzigar Kongtrul Rinpoche says, don't, when something difficult happens, don't turn around like a dog that's been bitten and run away. you have to be poised for practice. You have to have the mind that can accommodate anything. And that's, at the core of mind training teachings. And it is radical, as Tara Brach says. I mean, I love that phrase,
Hmm.
radical. She's acknowledging that it's a challenge and that it may feel uncomfortable at the outset. But it's so crucial to do, and
Hmm.
it's so liberating. It's power to overcome things that we've been, like anger. If we've habituated ourselves to anger in a certain way, a mind training teaching in conjunction with meditation, or um, even a supportive community, whatever it may be, you can leap over that very, very quickly. The pithy instructions have the power to kind of unlock those knots in our habituated selves.
Hmm. Thanks. Well, that's emphasizing the openness and the curiosity again. That
Yeah.
may be a nice place to end, so we can take those thoughts with us into the rest of our day.
Yeah, it's so important. Yeah, definitely, to be open to that, especially now with what we're going through, right? I mean, the political stuff we've gone through, we have a global pandemic, and they're all of those narratives are boxing us in, and we want to remain fresh and joyful and open to the possibility of transformation and the reality of transformation.
Yeah,
Um,
that openness extends to our enemies and our problems and the
yeah.
obstacles in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, it reorients our whole selves, our whole body will to a different way of life, a better way of life for ourselves and the people around us, whatever your faith may be. You know,
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thanks a lot for joining us, Stephen. It was amazing to get to talk to you, and I'm excited for our audience to get to know
uh,
you a little better.
yeah, no, it's great. It's a unique experience to be on this side of the mic, but it's wonderful to work on this podcast with you, Scott. So I'm really, really glad.
Well, thanks a lot. I was really shocked and um, overjoyed when you volunteered to help. So still amazed that you put in so much effort and your perfectionism, to so many aspects of it. So thank you so much.
Hey, no problem. Thank you.
So for everybody listening, thanks a lot for joining me in getting to know our producer, Stephen Butler. I hope we'll be hearing more of him in future episodes as we coax him in front of the microphone again. Um, if you'd like to get updates on podcast episodes, as well as Skeptic's Path meditations, talks, and classes, please join our newsletter or our social media accounts on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. You can find us under the name Skeptic's Path. If you'd like to support the podcast, there's a link on our website to donate, and even very small amounts go a long way, as all the proceeds go to producing the show. If you're on an Apple device in particular, we'd be grateful if you took a moment to review us in the podcast app. It's easy. You can put a little rating. Hopefully, you like the podcast if you've listened this far. The reviews help people discover our podcast, and we keep it free of. We keep all of our content free and free from ads in this way. So thanks again to Stephen Butler. Thanks a lot for not only being our guest today, but also for producing this and all of our episodes.
No, it's
Have,
great.
thanks. And everybody have a wonderful day.
Yeah, definitely.